In 1951, one brewery in the heart of New Orleans produced over 156,000 barrels of beer in a single year, enough to pour approximately 39 million pints into the glasses of an entire city that already considered drinking a sacred tradition. Walk into any neighborhood bar along the Gulf Coast in those post-war years and you would find it there. Cold, amber, unmistakable, poured from a tap beneath a neon sign that glowed like something between a promise and a prayer. They called it Dixie Beer. The locals called it home. At its peak, Dixie Brewing Company commanded more than 30% of the New Orleans beer market. Not 30% of a small town. 30% of one of the most fiercely loyal, culturally distinct drinking cities in the entire United States. That was not market share. That was dominance. That was identity. Dixie was not merely a beverage. For generations of New Orleanians, it was woven into the fabric of Mardi Gras, Jazz Fest, second line parades, Saints games, and backyard crawfish boils. It appeared in Hollywood films. It was poured at jazz clubs where Pete Fountain played clarinet, and the whole city seemed to breathe in rhythm. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Not once, not twice, but again and again and again, in ways so improbable, so brutal, and so deeply American that the story reads less like a business history and more like a long, slow funeral for an era that will never return. Today, the equipment that once brewed the soul of New Orleans sits auctioned off, scattered to strangers, silent. So how does a brewery that survived Prohibition, federal raids, bankruptcy, and a hurricane ultimately disappear? What forces conspired to erase a name that lasted 117 years? And what does that loss tell us about the fragility of legacy in modern America? This is the rise, the ruin, and the final chapter of Dixie Brewing Company. The story begins on a Halloween night in 1907, in a city that was already drunk on its own mythology. October 31st, 1907. New Orleans, Louisiana. The city of New Orleans had been drinking beer for longer than most American cities had existed. German immigrants flooded into Louisiana throughout the 1800s, and they brought with them something more valuable than money. They brought centuries of brewing knowledge, fermentation traditions, and an iron refusal to drink poorly made lager. By the time the 20th century arrived, New Orleans was home to nearly 50 operating breweries, earning its unofficial title as the brewing capital of the American South. Into this crowded, competitive landscape stepped Valentine Mertz. He was not an unknown. Mertz came from a family with deep roots in the New Orleans brewing industry. His relatives had operated in the city's beer trade before him, and he himself had already built a successful career as a restaurant operator and beer distributor. He understood, in the bone-deep way that only veteran tradespeople understand, that the product was never just the product. The relationship between a neighborhood and its beer was personal. It was ritualistic. It was loyal in a way that transcended ordinary commerce. On the final day of October, he opened the doors of Dixie Brewing Company at 2401 Tulane Avenue, in a neighborhood that would later be known as Mid-City. The building itself was designed by German architect Louis Lehler, a towering, ornate brick structure with a distinctive cupola that rose above the rooftops of the surrounding blocks like a declaration. From the very beginning, Dixie was not built to be subtle. The initial capitalization stood at $160,000. The plant was designed with a capacity of 75,000 barrels of beer per year. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the appetite of this city. Before a single site had been secured, before one brick had been laid, the entire first output of kegs was already contracted. Fully. Every barrel spoken for before the brewery existed. New Orleans did not wait for Dixie to prove itself. It simply assumed it would be magnificent. And for decades, it was. But the very confidence that made Dixie's founding so remarkable, that certainty, that swagger, that assumption of permanence, would ultimately make the company's vulnerabilities harder to see. When you are surrounded by people who believe you can do no wrong, it becomes easier to believe it yourself. The slogan Mertz adopted said it plainly: one brewery, 45 brands. That number would grow, and the ambition behind it would shape Dixie's trajectory for generations. 1920. New Orleans, Louisiana. When the National Prohibition Act swept across the United States on the 16th of January, it did not arrive as a surprise. The temperance movement had been building for years. Its tide rising through churches, political offices, and newspaper editorials. But in New Orleans, a city whose entire cultural identity was organized around the pleasures of eating, drinking, and celebration, prohibition was not merely inconvenient. It was personally offensive. Dozens of breweries across Louisiana simply could not survive the transition. They shuttered, dismantled their equipment, and disappeared. Dixie did not. Valentine Mertz renamed his operation the Dixie Beverage Company and pivoted, at least publicly, to producing near beer, a malt beverage containing less than 0.5% of alcohol, technically legal under the Volstead Act. The company also began selling ice, soft drinks, and even ice cream under a brand called Dixo. On paper, it was a model of compliant adaptation. In practice, the reality was considerably more complicated. In June of 1921, federal agents fanned out across New Orleans and raided 6 breweries in a single sweep. At the Dixie plant on Tulane Avenue, they found 500 cases of actual beer, not near beer, along with 120 full casks. The charges came swiftly. A little over a year later, federal agents returned. They seized the plant a second time. Hundreds of additional kegs were confiscated. Officers of the company were indicted by a federal grand jury, and they pleaded guilty. The Dixie plant was sold at public auction for $91,000. By most logical measures, that should have been the end. It was not. Mertz continued to operate, continued to rebuild, continued to fight, but the costs of those prohibition years, financial, legal, reputational, would leave marks. Valentine Mertz himself would not survive to see the end of the dry era. He died of a heart attack in 1929, 4 years before beer was legal again. On April the 6th, 1933, the 18th Amendment's grip finally broke. Beer was legal. Ship whistles rang out across the New Orleans waterfront. Dixie trucks rolled through the streets. The city celebrated as though it had personally won a war. In a sense, it had. And Dixie was reborn. 1945 through 1951. New Orleans, Louisiana. The post-war years were extraordinary for American manufacturing, and Dixie Brewing Company rode that wave with the confidence of an institution that had already outlasted catastrophe. By the late 1940s, as the brewery on Tulane Avenue was the beating heart of Mid-City, its brick tower visible from half the neighborhood, its dome illuminated by 4-sided neon lettering that read Dixie Beer in glowing amber against the New Orleans sky. Workers arriving for the morning shift would pass through gates that opened onto a floor of machinery stretching as far as a man could see. The fermentation cellars were cavernous. The bottling lines ran in thunderous rhythm. The smell of hops and malt drifted through the surrounding streets like a permanent benediction, a reminder that something was being made here, something the city needed. By 1951, Dixie was producing 156,867 barrels of beer in a single calendar year. Let that number breathe. That is approximately 39 million pints of beer. That is enough to give every man, woman and child in New Orleans in that era more than 60 pints each in a single year. That is not regional production. That is dominance. Throughout Louisiana, Mississippi and Alabama, Dixie held commanding market presence. In New Orleans itself, it owned more than 30% of all beer sold. The other major regional players, Falstaff, Regal, and the Jackson Brewing Company's Jack's Beer, competed fiercely. But Dixie's identity was singular. Its marketing slogan, "The beer that's rather be best than biggest," was simultaneously humble and shrewd. In a city that despised pretension and worshipped authenticity, it was exactly the right message. The building on Tulane Avenue had also become something greater than a factory. It was a neighborhood institution, 7 floors of brick and iron, an ornate round window above the main office, a crow's nest at the very top where workers once climbed to change the flag, a task they described as terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. It was the kind of building that made people proud simply to live nearby. But 1951 would prove to be the apex, the summit from which the long, painful descent would begin. And as every New Orleanian knows, the city's most beautiful moments often carry their tragedies embedded inside them, already waiting. 1960 through 1972. New Orleans, Louisiana. The American beer industry underwent a transformation in the 1960s that was as ruthless as it was methodical. The interstate highway system, still relatively young but rapidly expanding, had changed the economics of distribution. For the first time in the country's history, a brewery in St. Louis or Milwaukee could ship beer efficiently and cheaply to any corner of the nation. National brands arrived in the South not with a bang but with a slow, relentless accumulation of shelf space, radio advertising and television commercials that regional breweries simply could not match. Budweiser, Miller, Pabst. These names were not merely competing for taste preferences. They were competing for mental real estate, and they had the advertising budgets of empires behind them. For Dixie, the effect was gradual at first, then vertiginous. Sales began their decline in the early 1960s, pulling away from the record-setting peaks of the previous decade, with the quiet inevitability of a tide going out. The brewery could still produce, the beer was still there, but New Orleans drinkers, like consumers everywhere, were being educated by advertising, taught that national brands were somehow superior, modern, prestigious. Then came the incident that would wound Dixie in ways no competitor ever could. During renovations to the fermentation cellar, workers installed new flooring. The materials used in that installation released phenol fumes, chemical vapours that permeated the brewing vats during the production process without anyone immediately realising what was happening. The resulting beer was not dangerous to human health, but it was deeply, unmistakably wrong in flavour. And approximately 45,000 cases of that contaminated product made it out of the brewery and into the hands of customers before the problem was identified. That's 45,000 cases. That is roughly 540,000 individual bottles of beer, each one capable of becoming a story, a complaint, a reason never to buy Dixie again. The brewmaster was dismissed. The company spent $500,000 remodeling the plant. Dixie even sent trucks through neighbourhoods, handing out free six-packs door to door in an act of desperate apology. But some customers never returned. The damage to the brand's reputation was not catastrophic. It was worse than catastrophic. It was slow and cumulative, the kind of wound that bleeds quietly for years. Here is what nobody saw coming. By the close of the 1970s, every other brewery in the state of Louisiana would be gone. Every single one. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We are only halfway through this story, and the most extraordinary chapters are still ahead. 1979. New Orleans, Louisiana. By 1979, Dixie Brewing Company stood completely alone. Falstaff, once a titan of the New Orleans market, had closed its local plant. Regal was gone. Jack's Beer, which had operated since 1891 just across from Jackson Square in the French Quarter, had shuttered its celebrated Decatur Street facility in 1974. It was now a shopping centre. An entire generation of Louisiana brewing culture had been erased in the span of roughly a decade. Only Dixie remained. And even Dixie was bleeding. In 1981, the company introduced Dixie Light, a lower-calorie lager designed to chase the emerging light beer trend that Miller Lite had ignited nationwide. It helped. Sales improved modestly, but light beer was a bandage on a deeper wound, not a cure for it. The structural problems facing Dixie were not ones that a new product line could fix. The factory on Tulane Avenue was aging. The equipment required constant, expensive maintenance. and competing against the marketing budgets of Anheuser-Busch and Miller Brewing Company with the resources of a regional operation was, in the parlance of the era, bringing a bottle opener to a gunfight. In 1982, management made a decision that signalled just how dire the situation had become. 20% of the brewery's entire workforce was laid off in a single round of cuts. As the men and women who had spent years inside that building, who knew every valve, every pipe, every rhythm of the production line, walked out the gates carrying their last paychecks. By 1983, the Bruno family's dreams and the Mertz family's legacy had both run out of runway. Dixie Brewing Company was sold to Coy International, a New Orleans-based corporation that saw value in the brand even if it struggled to articulate precisely what to do with it. The sale was a transaction. It was not a rescue. 2 years later, in November of 1985, Coy International sold the brewery again, this time to Joseph and Kendra Elliott Bruno. What came next was either remarkable entrepreneurship or magnificent stubbornness, depending on your point of view. Probably both. November 1985. New Orleans, Louisiana. Kendra Elliott. Bruno was, by any measure, an unlikely brewery owner. She and her husband Joseph had no background in beer production, no experience managing a manufacturing facility, and no obvious reason to invest in a struggling, aging operation that multiple previous owners had found impossible to sustain. Her family had connections to the beverage world. Her grandparents had brought Barks root beer to Louisiana. But root beer and lager are separated by more than just their ingredients. What Kendra Bruno had was something harder to quantify. She described it as a sense of obligation. The brewery was a piece of New Orleans history. It employed people whose families had worked those floors for generations, and nobody else was standing in line to save it. Somebody had to do it, she would later say. Nobody was standing in line, and nobody was there, and we were in for a penny, in for a pound. The reality they inherited was grim. The government had, almost immediately after the acquisition, rescinded an excise tax exemption that had been worth over $750,000 annually to the brewery's bottom line. $750,000 per year, removed with the stroke of an administrative pen. For a company already operating on compressed margins, it was devastating. In 1989, Dixie Brewing Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The Brunos did not walk away. Instead, they began the painstaking work of reorganization. And in 1990, while still technically operating under bankruptcy protection, they launched something bold. Blackened Voodoo Lager. Dixie's first super premium beer. A dark, rich, Munich, Dunkel-style lager brewed with 5 roasted barley malts and 2 varieties of hops, with an alcohol content of 5% and a label depicting a shadowy Louisiana swamp. The reviews were enthusiastic. The name was provocative, and then the state of Texas banned it. The Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission, reviewing Blackened Voodoo for sale permits, concluded that its name and label, with their references to voodoo and their swamp imagery, conjured associations with witchcraft and the occult. They refused to allow it on Texas shelves. What followed was something Kendra Bruno would later call the best thing that ever happened to Dixie. The Louisiana state legislature voted to retaliate by banning the sale of Lone Star beer. The story became national news. International news. The phone lines at Dixie rang with orders from across the country and around the world. And in February of 1992, a newspaper headline read, "Dixie brews itself out of Chapter 11. Bankruptcy." 1992 through 1999. New Orleans, Louisiana. The Texas ban on Blackened Voodoo Lager was lifted in the summer of 1991, when the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission's own legal counsel concluded that the prohibition was legally untenable. The commission acknowledged there was nothing it could do to keep the beer out. Faced with legal questions and widespread ridicule, not least from the Louisiana legislature's threatened counterattack on Lone Star, the regulators relented. Texas shelves received their first shipment. And Kendra Bruno, ever the diplomat, was told reporters she was happy that her Texas neighbours would have the opportunity to enjoy their bewitching brew. The voodoo controversy had done something no advertising campaign could have purchased. It gave Dixie a national identity. Here was a New Orleans brewery, scrappy and defiant, making a beer bold enough to get itself banned by government officials who apparently feared supernatural influence. In a craft beer landscape that was just beginning to take shape across the United States, the blackened voodoo story was exactly the kind of mythology a brand needed to transcend its regional roots. Coming out of Chapter 11 in February 1992, Dixie moved quickly to capitalize. The brewery launched Crimson Voodoo, a red ale designed to complement the dark lager that had already caused such national commotion. In 1993, Jazz Amber Light followed, a lighter, more accessible beer with a name that positioned Dixie squarely within New Orleans culture and its most beloved annual celebration. The building on Tulane Avenue hummed with renewed energy. Pre-Katrina production would eventually reach 1 million cases annually. Brewmaster Kevin Stewart, who had come to work at Dixie in the 1980s, was refining the recipes and overseeing a facility that finally felt, after years of crisis, like it had a future. Dixie's beer appeared in Hollywood films during this period, in Clint Eastwood's thriller Tightrope, in the ensemble drama Steel Magnolias, in numerous other productions that used New Orleans as a setting and chose Dixie as an authenticating detail. You did not need a prop master to explain what Dixie beer meant. Its presence communicated everything. By the late 90s, Dixie was the sole remaining old-line brewery in New Orleans. The last survivor, the last voice of a tradition that had once sustained nearly 50 brewing operations in a single city. It was a distinction that carried enormous pride. It also carried enormous weight. August 29th, 2005. New Orleans, Louisiana. Hurricane Katrina made landfall along the Louisiana Gulf Coast in the early morning hours of August 29, 2005, carrying winds that exceeded 175 miles per hour, and a storm surge that pushed water inland with the force of a slow-motion avalanche. The city had been warned, many had evacuated. The Dixie Brewing Company on Tulane Avenue had been secured as best it could be, its workers long since dispersed to safety. What the preparation could not stop was the water. When the levees failed, a series of catastrophic engineering collapses that the federal government would later be found substantially responsible for, the mid-city neighbourhood where Dixie sat was inundated. The water rose and kept rising. By the time it reached its peak inside the old brewery at 2401 Tulane Avenue, more than 10 feet of floodwater stood inside those historic brick walls. 10 feet. Enough to submerge a full-grown man standing on the shoulders of another full-grown man. Enough to destroy every piece of mechanical brewing equipment on the ground floor. Enough to ruin packaging, supplies, stored product, and decades of institutional infrastructure in a single catastrophic event. Then, as the waters slowly receded over the following weeks, something equally devastating occurred. Looters entered the abandoned building. Without electricity, without security, without any functioning city infrastructure to protect it, the Dixie Brewing Company was stripped. Copper piping, brewing equipment, anything of value that could be carried or removed was taken. When the building was finally accessible for assessment, what remained was a gutted ruin. The human cost of Hurricane Katrina across New Orleans was staggering. Nearly 2,000 deaths, hundreds of thousands of displaced residents, an entire city broken open and exposed. In the context of that scale of suffering, a brewery was a minor tragedy. But Dixie was more than a brewery. It was one of the last physical anchors of a brewing culture that stretched back over a century. And unlike lives, which can be rebuilt, that particular anchor was gone. Joseph and Kendra Bruno made early promises that the brewery would return to Tulane Avenue. Those promises could not be kept. The building was eventually incorporated into the footprint of a new Department of Veterans Affairs hospital in the Mid-City Medical District. The iconic tower, the one with Dixie Brewery spelled out in neon, was stabilized and preserved as a historic facade. The beer, for now, would have to come from somewhere else. 2005 through 2017. Monroe, Wisconsin. There is something quietly heartbreaking about a New Orleans beer being brewed in Wisconsin. Not because Wisconsin is without its own proud brewing tradition, it is not, but because Dixie Beer's entire identity rested on its relationship with a specific place, a specific culture, a specific set of streets and bars and celebrations that could not be replicated 900 miles north in a state where the winters last 6 months, and the nearest jazz club is a very long drive away. The Joseph Huber Brewing Company in Monroe, Wisconsin, became Dixie's production facility after Katrina. The arrangement was a pragmatic necessity. The Brunos had a brand, a recipe, a distribution network, and loyal customers who still wanted the beer. They had no brewery. Contract brewing was the only viable option that kept Dixie alive in any form. For 12 years, that is how it worked. Dixie Beer, the neighborhood beer of New Orleans, the drink of Mardi Gras and Second Lines and Saints' Victories, was manufactured in a small Wisconsin city and shipped south. Some customers noticed a difference in the product. Others remained loyal regardless. The brand's identity, already stretched thin by the disasters of the previous decades, grew thinner still under the strain of geography. The sales figures in those years were a fraction of what Dixie had once commanded. Distribution had contracted. Bar owners who had once reflexively stocked Dixie now filled their coolers with craft beers, IPAs, sours, saisons, brewed by Abita, the Louisiana craft brewery that had opened on the North Shore back in 1986. The craft beer revolution that transformed the American beer industry throughout the 2010s was not something Dixie, and as a contract-brewed legacy lager without a physical home, was equipped to participate in. Meanwhile, the building that had housed Dixie Soul for nearly a century became something else entirely. Medical offices, a VA hospital wing, history converted, brick by brick, into utility. The Brunos continued. Kendra Bruno, who had walked into that bankruptcy in 1989 with no experience and enormous determination, continued shepherding the brand through years that offered little reward and considerable hardship. It was a kind of devotion that resisted easy explanation. But devotion without resources has its limits, and by 2017, the Bruno era was coming to an end. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to this channel and allows us to keep bringing you stories this deep and this important. The final act is about to begin. 2017, New Orleans, Louisiana. Tom Benson was 80 years old when he purchased a majority stake in Dixie Brewing Company in the summer of 2017. And he was spending money the way that only a man who has already made his fortune can. Not for profit, but for love. Benson had grown up in New Orleans. He had built his business empire here. He owned the New Orleans Saints football franchise and the New Orleans Pelicans basketball team. And he was the kind of civic figure whose name appeared on buildings and whose opinions shaped conversations. He did not need Dixie Beer. He wanted it returned to New Orleans, as restored to its original recipe, brought back home from its Wisconsin exile. Under Benson's ownership, brewmaster Kevin Stewart, the same Kevin Stewart who had worked at Dixie since the 1980s, reformulated Dixie using the brewery's original recipe. Production was moved from Monroe, Wisconsin, to the Blues City Brewery in Memphis, Tennessee, a temporary arrangement while Benson's team searched for an appropriate New Orleans site to build something permanent. By late 2017, Dixie Beer was appearing at Saints concession stands inside the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, served to fans who regarded its return with a mixture of nostalgia and cautious optimism. The vision was grand. An 85,000 square foot facility in New Orleans East, a historically underserved and underinvested portion of the city, built inside an existing warehouse on a 14-acre property. The new brewery would feature a replica of the original Tulane Avenue brick tower. The actual metal lettering removed from the exterior of the old building would be reinstalled on the new one. There would be a tap room, a beer garden, a museum containing over 800 artifacts from New Orleans brewing history, a grassy meadow with a pond, bocce ball courts, walking paths, fire pits, and a private event space, with a bar built from a vintage fermenting tank salvaged from the original brewery. It was not merely a brewery, it was an act of resurrection. But here is the thing about resurrection. It requires not just belief, but infrastructure, plus market conditions and timing. Tom Benson would not live to see the doors open. On March 15, 2018, Thomas Milton Benson died at the age of 80, leaving behind a city that mourned him and a brewery that still existed only on architectural drawings. 2018 through 2020. New Orleans, Louisiana. Gail Benson inherited her husband's majority stake in the Dixie Brewing Company along with his other business holdings, following Tom's death in March of 2018. She also inherited his promise to bring the brewery back to New Orleans, to give the city something back, to honour a tradition that both of them had grown up with. She did not walk away from it. On August 7, 2018, as Gail Benson's team announced the specifics of the new brewery plan, the site on Jordan Road in New Orleans East was confirmed. Construction began on a facility that would ultimately cost in the range of $30 million. Every detail of the design was deliberate. The replica of the old brick tower, the salvaged metal letters, the museum, the beer garden, the event space. Gail Benson was not building a factory. She was building a monument to memory. On November 25, 2019, the Dixie Brewing Company brewed its first batch of beer in New Orleans since 2005. 14 years of exile ended. On January 25, 2020, the brewery opened its doors to the public. Then, 5 days later, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern over a novel coronavirus. By March, the United States entered lockdown. Bars and restaurants, the lifeblood of any beer brand, closed across Louisiana. The tap room at Faubourg, which had opened to such celebration just weeks earlier, went dark along with everything else. The timing was, in the language of polite understatement, deeply unfortunate. But Gail Benson continued. And in November of 2020, she announced a decision that would prove far more controversial than anyone anticipated. The brewery would change its name. Dixie, a word with deep and complicated roots in Southern American history, a term inseparable from Confederate symbolism for many Americans, would be retired. The brewery's new identity would become Faubourg, and after the French term for the neighbourhoods of New Orleans. The intention was unity. The execution was costly. The name Faubourg, resonant and meaningful inside Louisiana, registered as unfamiliar to most of the beer market beyond it. And the brand, already rebuilding from years of contract brewing and a pandemic, now had to rebuild its name as well. September 2022 through November 2023. New Orleans, Louisiana, and Birmingham, Alabama. In September of 2022, Gail Benson announced a merger that was supposed to change everything. Made by the Water, an Alabama-based portfolio company that operated craft breweries including Catawba Brewing in Asheville, North Carolina, Oyster City in Apalachicola, Florida, and Palmetto Brewing in Charleston, South Carolina, would acquire a majority stake in Faubourg Brewing Company. At the time of the merger, Made by the Water's combined portfolio of brands had produced 51,000 barrels of beer in 2022, a 17% increase over the prior year. The company ranked as the 50th largest craft brewery in the United States by volume. Faubourg's 85,000 square foot facility, valued at $30 million, would become Made by the Water's primary production hub, with an ambition to push annual output north of 100,000 barrels. City officials praised the deal. Economic development advocates celebrated it. The vision, articulated in press releases and public statements, was of Faubourg becoming one of the largest craft beer producers in the United States and the largest in the Southeast. Made by the Water's CEO, 30-year-old Alexei Sekmakis spoke of turning New Orleans East into a regional beer-making centre. The problem was that the facility was not ready for that vision. Equipment upgrades were needed. The New Orleans East location, remote from the city's tourist centres, positioned in a neighbourhood that was still rebuilding nearly 2 decades after Katrina, created staffing difficulties. Crime concerns were cited internally. And then there was the water bill. The Sewerage and Water Board of New Orleans, the utility responsible for water service in the parish, charged Faubourg a water bill that consistently exceeded $50,000 per month. Monthly. For water alone. Sekmakis told reporters that New Orleans water costs were between 10 and 20 times what comparable production would cost elsewhere. A fire at the brewery in April of 2023 added further disruption. Power outages compounded the instability. In November of 2023, Made by the Water announced that it was shutting down large-scale production at the New Orleans East Brewhouse. The goal of 100,000 barrels was abandoned. Just over a year after the deal had been celebrated, the dream had collapsed. May 1st, 2024. New Orleans, Louisiana. There is a particular kind of sadness that arrives not with a sudden crash, but with a slow and inevitable exhale. The sadness of watching something that has been in decline finally stop trying. New Orleans knows that feeling well. It has watched it happen to jazz clubs, neighbourhood restaurants, corner stores that survived 3 generations before the 4th simply could not hold on. And now it watched it happen to Dixie, to Faubourg, to the last remnant of 117 years of continuous brewing heritage. The final event at the Faubourg Brewing Company was a 2-day music festival called Days Between NOLA, held between the first and second weekends of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival in May of 2024. It was, by all accounts, a good party, the kind of ending that New Orleans specialises in, a celebration dressed as a farewell. Local cuisine was served. Art vendors filled the grounds. Jazz, funk and soul music poured from 2 stages into the warm spring air. And then it was over. And following the festival, the company officially announced its closure. The equipment inventory, the tanks, the fermenters, the packaging lines, the machinery that had been purchased for $30 million and installed with such deliberate hope, would be auctioned off in June, dismantled and scattered. Made by the Water, which had become the majority operator, did not respond to media requests for comment on the closure. The company that had arrived with visions of southeastern beer empire had, in the span of roughly 18 months, also closed multiple Catawba locations in the Carolinas and significantly reduced its overall workforce. It was not merely Faubourg that was struggling, the entire portfolio was contracting. For Gail Benson, whose $30 million investment had produced a facility open for roughly 4 years, interrupted by a pandemic, strained by utility costs, disrupted by a corporate partner's implosion, the loss was both financial and personal. Her team issued a statement expressing continued commitment to economic development in New Orleans East. But the brewery was silent. The building on Jourdain Road stood as a monument to what New Orleans had attempted, and what the economics of the modern craft beer industry had refused to allow. The old tower replica, its letters spelling out a name that no longer appeared on any product, looked out over a parking lot where the beer trucks used to line up. Gone. Quietly. Without sufficient ceremony for what had been lost. Stand at the corner of Jourdain Road in New Orleans East today, and you will find a building designed to look like memory. The brick tower is there, a replica of the one that once rose over Tulane Avenue in mid-city, the one that Valentine Mertz and architect Louis Lael built on Halloween night in 1907. The metal letters, salvaged from the original building and reinstalled on this newer one, still spell out the brewery's name. They just no longer mean anything operational. No beer is being brewed here. The equipment has been auctioned. The workers are gone. If you look closely, you can see the care with which it was all designed. Someone loved this place into existence. Tom and Gail Benson spent $30 million and years of effort trying to give New Orleans back something it had lost. That intention matters. But intention alone could not save Dixie. and the reasons it could not tell us something essential about the world in which American legacy brands now have to survive. There is a lesson about the tyranny of timing. Valentine Mertz opened his brewery at exactly the right moment, when New Orleans was already the brewing capital of the South and the appetite for local beer was enormous. But every subsequent crisis arrived at the wrong moment. Prohibition before the company had sufficient legal cushion. National brands before regional breweries had tools to compete. Hurricane Katrina before the craft beer movement could have reframed Dixie's identity. The pandemic 5 days after the new facility opened. Timing is not something a business can control, but it is often what kills them. There is a lesson about identity and the cost of abandonment. For nearly 100 years, Dixie Beer's greatest asset was not its recipe, it was its name, its deep, specific, culturally embedded relationship with one city. When the brand was forced to abandon that name in 2020, it lost the very thing that made it worth saving. Faubourg was a beautiful word, but it was not Dixie. And without Dixie, the brand became a beer in search of an identity it had already possessed and surrendered. There is a lesson about the cruelty of infrastructure. The $50,000 monthly water bill that helped doom Faubourg was not a result of poor management or bad strategy. It was the reality of doing business in a city whose infrastructure, damaged by Katrina, underfunded for decades, cannot support large-scale industrial production without imposing costs that make competitiveness nearly impossible. From 1907 to 2024, Dixie Brewing Company brewed through Prohibition, federal raids, bankruptcy, phenol contamination, national brand consolidation, a catastrophic hurricane, a 12-year Wisconsin exile, a pandemic, a rebrand, and a failed corporate merger. 117 years of survival. Then silence. What remains is a tower, a memory, and the particular, irreplaceable sadness of a city that keeps losing the things that made it what it is.